I'm very confused about core training. Why do we maintain a posterior tilt throughout the range when in real life the sacrum would nutate with hip extension? So Muhammad's right. I need to have these relative motions of the pelvis, counter nutation, when I'm doing more flexion, abduction, external rotation activities, and the sacrum needs to nutate when I do extension, adduction, and internal rotation activities. So Muhammad is totally on point with this. Zach, why in the heck are we cueing this posterior tilt with most of the activities here when we got to have the sacrum nutating? What's going on with that? What is going on with that goes back to what we were talking about with Bob's question, which is if most individuals have a bias towards an anterior orientation, how would you know if this is you? You can't squat all the way down. You have limited hip flexion because you can't get the relative motion at the sacrum to occur. You might have a loss of hip extension. Basically, if you have a loss of several movement options, more often than not, you're probably dealing with some type of anterior orientation. What the posterior tilt serves to do is to go the opposite direction. So if I got someone who can only move their pelvis forward and they can't move it back, I have to be able to move it back first and foremost to give that person the full movement spectrum at the pelvis. But here's a little nuance that maybe we might be missing with this particular piece. And I just came to this realization the other day. Folks, do you ever wonder how much, we talk a lot about nutation of the sacrum and counter nutation, but do you know how many degrees of motion are available at the SI joint because that's where that's happening? It's only about 2 degrees. So can we really be so precise with our posterior tilt of the pelvis that we can isolate it specifically to sacral counter nutation only? Can we be so precise when we do hip extension that we're only going to allow that 2 degrees of nutation at the sacrum? I'm not that good, and I don't think any of us are. So, but this has kind of been the crux of what we've been trying to target, right, Zach? So how in the heck are we going to get counter nutation and nutation of the sacrum to occur, assuming that we're not doing a crazy amount of lumbar flexion and maybe we're making the pelvic movements that we're discussing very subtle? What I think actually creates the relative counter nutation and nutation of the sacrum, and this to me is much more realistic, is the breathing component when we're talking about a lot of the exercises in question. Because when you set up the pelvis to be posteriorly tilted and you take care of the bottom portion of the stack, when you take a breath of air in and a breath of air out, assuming you've gotten that exhaled orientation that we want of the diaphragm, meaning it's ascended as can be. When you take a breath of air in and you minimize compensatory activities, that downward displacement of the viscera during inhalation is going to promote counter nutation of the sacrum because you're going to get a change in the relative orientation of the pelvic floor. And then when you exhale, that's going to create the nutation of the sacrum that is needed. And that's what restores the relative motion in this respective area. It's not hold the posterior tilt and then just move like this forever. It's breathing and expressing movement options that is going to take care of it. And that's one thing that I've probably had an issue with a lot of the people who I've coached with that I've been doing a much better job of now getting them to appreciate is a lot of times people will go through activities, whether it's a squat or maybe it's some of the, a chop or a core exercise or anything, and they would just tuck. They would just go tuck themselves. And I'm like, well, tuck you, that's not what I'm talking about. I want you to tuck and get the full exhale component, because when I get that, then I'm going to get that counter nutation and nutation of the sacrum. Because when people would only tuck, they would not get the most out of the activity. They might do some weird thing in the squat where they're shoving the pelvis way forward. They might complain of some back discomfort, and they might, like on a split squat, their pelvis might look like it's in a good orientation, but you'll see their rib cage jut way forward, which is a common compensatory strategy that you'll see in a split squat. And I think the reason why that is, shame on your boy Big Z, but hey, I'm getting better just like the rest of us, is you have to take into account the lower rib cage position with this. And it's that mechanism of breathing that's going to restore the relative motions that we should be seeing at the sacroiliac joint. Now, folks, this doesn't mean that, all right, we're going to go do some cutting training, and we're going to work on your change of direction capabilities, but before you descend into the cut, you got to make sure you got this posterior tilt. You got to make sure your lower rib cage gets dropped and everything will be good. False. That's not what I'm talking about. When I'm talking about these concepts, especially with some of the things that Muhammad was mentioning, we're utilizing the stack to restore movement options, and to me, this is better served when we're talking about lower intensity and slower speed activities. So any of the basic reset drills that you might see on my YouTube channel, any of the day one material in terms of coaching the stack or activities that restore movement options at my seminar, Human Matrix, those types of things. And I would even argue some of the loading activities that we might do with an individual, such as any anterior loaded squatting, split squats, step-ups, pushes and pulls, those are the times where I think focusing on these concepts, especially if the goal is to maximize movement capabilities, is paramount. And you might be coaching a little bit of a tuck with these activities, but don't worry, Mohammed. You're going to get some nutation of the sacrum if you're getting a full exhalation. Or if, hey, you got someone who needs to be a part of the counter nutation nation, well, if you get them a good inhale and they keep a little bit of the ab tension, they're going to be able to express that movement that you oh so desire. Where I'm not coaching this is higher speed things. Meaning, if I got someone who's jumping, I don't have them get their tuck, I don't have them get their exhale, and then they jump. That's unrealistic. That's not going to transfer adequately to the terminal tasks that they may want to do. Same thing with cutting, change of direction, sprinting. Not going to do it during those moves. But what I am going to do is choose appropriate exercises with the appropriate constraints where they can demonstrate the movement qualities that I want them to be able to do and that they should be able to do to produce the most force, move the fastest, be as explosive as it can be, and minimize any potential negative consequences of the task. For example, let's take a counter movement jump where you're just dipping down and jumping up as high as you can. If you want to jump really high in the air, you want to get as vertical as can be, your counter movement needs to be downward, not backward. You don't need a posterior pelvic movement. It has to be downward. Think of it like a bouncy ball. If you wanted the bouncy ball to go as high as possible in the air, straight up, you want to throw it straight down into the ground. You're not going to bounce it off against the wall, even though it might go pretty high in that particular situation. But you want it to go straight down, straight up. You want the same thing to happen with your body when you're doing a vertical jump. You want a quick dip down so you can elicit the stretch shortening cycle, and that will get you to sky high. If you have someone, when they jump, instead of dipping straight down, they bend over at the waist and then they jump, they might be able to jump really high with that. I've seen it a lot of times when I was in the NBA and we were doing pre-draft stuff and you'd test someone's vertical. Most of the top jumpers would do that. But the problem with that is in game, it's really slow and it's not the best strategy. If you got to go get a rebound, you're not going to bend forward at the waist, take your time to get in position, then sky really high. No, you got to jump really fast, and you likely want to minimize ground contact and take advantage of the stretch shortening cycle by doing that quick dip down and up. So if you have someone who has a difficult time with that, you might need to select an intervention or a strategy that works on their ability to initiate that quick dip into the vertical jump and minimizes either forward bending at the waist or posterior pelvic displacement. What this might be is you could do a seated box jump. You could do a seated box jump to tap, where basically what I do, and I actually did this with someone this week. I worked with an individual who was not getting any downward movement. He's a super strong guy, so he just dips his body forward, shoots his hips back a little bit, and then gets high up in the air. So what I did in that particular situation was I had him stand in front of a box. He had to bend down, squat down, tap the box, and it wasn't super low. It was, he was probably getting about 45 degrees, 40 degrees of hip flexion. He had to tap down and then jump up to a box so we could get him vertically displacing his pelvis when he performed the vertical jump. We did that, and he was able to jump pain-free and was able to start initiating the counter movement that you need to jump well. I didn't tell him tuck his hips. I didn't tell him, hey, make sure you get that nice full exhale of your rib cage. Hold the posterior tilt the whole time. Didn't happen. I just chose an appropriate exercise for him to express the movement that he's supposed to. And that's really what you have to do when we're talking about the higher intensity activities. And really we should do that for just every activity. If you can choose a move that puts your supreme clientele into the positions that they need to get the adaptation you want, that should minimize the amount of coaching that you should have to do for that particular task. Doesn't mean it's completely eliminated, but it should reduce the amount, especially if you've taught them some of the fundamental concepts that they need to be expressing, aka the stack, aka talk to Zach, in the beginning. And that's where I differentiate these two things. So Mohammed, we don't need to posteriorly pelvic tilt through everything, but it is a useful way to restore movement options and teach some of the fundamental aspects that are needed to allow people to move effectively in multiple directions. Do you do that at high speeds? No. Do you need to do that with things where you're driving hip extension? Probably, but don't worry, you're going to get sacral nutation if you can perform the full breathing sequence without compensatory activity. Unbelievable question, Mohammed.